Hey Alexa, play my morning playlist. Hey Siri, what's the weather? We invite these voices into our homes, our cars, our pockets. They're everywhere. But how deep does that relationship actually go? Well, let's dive into this, because the data reveals a really fascinating and honestly a kind of complicated story about how we trust our AI.
Think about it. You get a new smart speaker, and for the first week, it's amazing. You ask it silly questions, you have it set timers, but then what happens? For so many of us, the novelty just fades, and that shiny new piece of tech becomes another clock collecting dust on a shelf. The real question is, why?
And this is a huge problem. Research shows that as many as 1 in 4 users become, passive. They basically abandon their device within just the first couple of weeks. That is a massive drop-off for a technology that's supposed to be weaving itself into the fabric of our daily lives.
So, to figure out what really makes us stick with these things, researchers did something pretty cool. They followed over 800 users for an entire year, tracking their habits and their feelings about these devices. And what they found? Well, it really challenges a lot of what we thought we knew about our relationship with tech. It turns out, whether we realize it or not, we're judging these machines on 2 very, very human scales. We're essentially putting them through what you could call a human test, asking ourselves one of 2 things. Are they competent or are they kind?
Let's break this down. On one hand, we're looking at them like a competent employee. Can they just get the job done right? This idea comes from something called social response theory, which basically says we can't help but react to tech like it's a person. But on the other hand, we're also judging them like a kind friend. Do they feel warm, personal, present? And that's all about social presence theory, which gets at how real an interaction feels.
So, when we're talking about competence, we're really looking at a few key things. First, interactivity. Does it feel like a real conversation, a genuine back and forth? Then there's reliability. Does it actually play the right song or set the timer correctly every single time? And finally, flexibility. Can it handle all the different kinds of tasks you might throw at it?
And then you've got the kindness side. This is all about personalization. Does it know your favorite playlists, your morning routine, and social presence? That's that kind of hard to define feeling that you're actually talking to something, not just shouting commands at a plastic cylinder. And of course, just plain old satisfaction. Are you happy with the whole experience? These are the big factors the study was measuring.
All right, so the researchers tracked all this for a full 12 months. After all that time, which of these things actually predicted whether people would keep using their devices? Well, the long-term verdict was pretty fascinating.
So here's what's really interesting. Our expectations completely change over time. At the start, reliability didn't really have a big impact. If the assistant messed up sometimes, whatever, it was no big deal. But a year later, it became one of the most important things. It seems we get way less forgiving the longer we own them. We just expect them to work.
The other huge factor was personalization. The more the assistant felt like it was truly yours, remembering your preferences, knowing your calendar, understanding your tastes, the stronger that bond became. This proves we don't just want some generic tool. We want a partner that actually adapts to us.
And this brings us to what might be the biggest surprise of the whole study. We think we want a device that can do 1,000 different things, right? But the data was clear. Flexibility, being a jack of all trades, had no significant effect on whether people kept using their assistant long-term. Turns out we'd much rather it do a few things really well than a bunch of things kind of poorly.
Okay, but here's where the story gets really complicated. We have these devices that are learning all about us, personalizing themselves for us, which, of course, means they're collecting a ton of data. So, what about privacy?
Right, we all make the joke about our assistants always listening. But does that fear actually change how we behave? Well, the study found that our concern about privacy isn't a simple yes or no. It actually evolves, and it starts to target some very specific features.
So here's how our feelings about privacy seem to build over time. At the very start of the study, privacy risk didn't affect usage at all. People just didn't really seem to care. But after 12 months, that changed. Privacy concerns started to have a real negative effect, but, and here's the twist, it only seemed to matter for the kind friend features, things like personalization and social presence.
And you can see it plain as day in the data. At the 12-month mark, privacy risk starts to undermine the very things that make us feel connected to our assistants, their ability to be personal and to feel present. In other words, the more human an assistant tries to be, the more our internal privacy alarms start going off. We seem to be okay with a competent tool listening in, but a kind friend? Suddenly that starts to feel, well, a little creepy.
So the bottom line is this.
As our technology gets smarter and more human-like, our relationship with it gets more complicated and, yeah, in some ways, more suspicious. And this has huge implications for pretty much everyone involved. Users, developers, everybody.
So what's the big takeaway here? For developers, the message seems pretty clear. Stop bloating your assistants with a million useless features. Focus on making them rock-solid reliable and deeply personal. But for that to even work, companies have got to be radically transparent about how our data is being used. And that's where policymakers need to step in, to create clear rules that give us, the users, actual control. And this quote from the researchers themselves just sums it all up perfectly. Our privacy concerns aren't really about the basic functions. They only wake up when the machine starts to feel a little too much like a person, when it starts to get personal. Which leaves us all with this final, really challenging question. We say we want technology that's personalized, that feels helpful and present, all very human qualities. But this study shows that the closer our AI gets to actually achieving that, the more our very human instincts for privacy and suspicion kick in. So what's the perfect balance? Honestly, that's the billion-dollar question for the entire future of AI.